Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining me. Today is our fourth and final lecture in the Silk Road series, which has led us from west to east across the continent of Asia. In part 1, we looked at the cities of Palmyra, Constantinople, and Venice, all three major trading centers in the Mediterranean world that grew wealthy through their locations and their abilities to control the circulation of goods. And in some cases, they also became not just places of exchange, but also centers of production in themselves. For example, the mercantile empire of Venice came to produce luxury fabrics after learning the necessary methods through their international trade network. In part 2, we looked at the Sasanians and the Sogdians, two groups who shared Iranian culture, the Iranian language family, and the Zoroastrian religion. We looked at how the Sasanians placed themselves as the successors to the Persian Empire and controlled a vast territory through which overland trade passed. We also considered how the Sogdians saw themselves as part of this broader Iranian world, and we looked at some of the artifacts and paintings from the Sogdian capital of Panjikend, which is today called Samarkand. This self-identity was then opposed to how the Sogdians were seen by East Asians, as large-nosed, bushy-bearded merchants and traveling musicians. This stereotype eventually crystallized into the stock character of the drunken barbarian in some East Asian stories and plays. And last time, we looked briefly at archaeological remains of the early indigenous residents of the Tarim Basin, which is a depression formed by two mountain ranges that contains the vast Taklamakan Desert. We then turned to how Buddhism spread beyond India, along the Silk Roads, and into the Tarim Basin, where people produced images in temple cave complexes that synthesized a diverse range of artistic and cultural influences thanks to the wide array of patrons. Now, throughout these talks, we've traversed about 2,200 years of history, but most of what we've looked at has happened in the antique and early medieval periods, about 100 to 1000 CE, but even more specifically, the 6th through the 10th centuries. Much of the cultural and commercial activity that happened across Central Asia via the Silk Roads network occurred thanks to the stability, prosperity, and wide-ranging influence of the Tang dynasty in the east. The Tang dynasty needed horses for its military, and these horses were purchased from groups and kingdoms in Central Asia. The profits from these sales then enabled Central Asian societies to invest in their own economies and to engage in additional international trade. Around the same time, in the West, the Islamic caliphates unified large stretches of territory, conquering the Sasanian Empire and beyond. They commanded vast natural resources, fostered the growth of large urban centers with disposable income, and controlled the majority of trade between the Mediterranean and points east. But the trade routes that didn't go only by land. We have seen how the Silk Road is really a web of various paths that connect to one another across the continent of Asia. But these trails are as part of a still larger network that includes sea routes. We know from historical sources and archaeology that there was a very active sea route that directly connected the Arab and Persian West to China, Korea, and Japan in the east. The purple lines on this map show you the primary routes and some of the main ports. So today we'll be looking at these connections by sea, what is often referred to as the Maritime Silk Road. As we'll see, it was by ship that many objects and people traveled using both the open seas and rivers. Voyages along the Maritime Silk Road could be helped or hindered depending on the season and the destination. During the summer, monsoonal winds blow towards the northeast, whereas in winter they blow towards the southwest. So, if the monsoonal winds were active, a ship could go from the port of Muscat in modern Oman to the city of Guangzhou in China in about 6 months, not counting any time spent in port. Now, until quite recently, scholars believed that ships from West Asia or East Asia would meet in India to swap products rather than sailing from China to Persia or vice versa. There were many who argued that surely people had sailed the whole way, but there was no real actual proof that anyone had truly sailed clear from the Persian Gulf to China or vice versa, at least not before the 14th century or so, much less that it was a common thing to do. But that changed with the discovery of a shipwreck near Sumatra in 1998. The shipwreck was found by local divers in very shallow water just off the island of Belitung. And the excavation was especially difficult because looting began almost immediately, even with military guards posted nearby. Indonesia was experiencing internal problems, and there were few resources and very little time. I want to give you a few details of the excavation and the controversy surrounding it. So the Indonesian government contacted a commercial salvage company out of New Zealand to perform the excavations, which they did over the course of 2 seasons. A company attached to the government of Singapore then purchased the entire collection, and it's now in permanent loan to the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. So far, so good. Now, 12 years later, in 2011, the Smithsonian was going to do an exhibition of their recovered artifacts, but there was a big fuss because of the fact that the excavation had been performed by a commercial company and not by a museum or university or some other academic organization. Critics have argued that this was a violation of a UNESCO resolution regarding the handling of underwater cultural heritage, that the excavation was so poorly done that it ruined any opportunity to actually learn things from the wreck, and that exhibiting the discoveries would actually serve to encourage illegal looting and treasure hunting. So in response to these arguments, the Smithsonian canceled the exhibition, and really only a handful of museums in the United States have shown any material from the shipwreck. Now, there are some problems with these arguments. First, if you notice the date of the UNESCO resolution, it was accepted by the UN in 2001. This is 2 full years after the excavation had ended. So kind of hard to, follow a resolution that hasn't even been formed yet. But even as of 2023, Indonesia has not accepted the resolution, nor, as you can see, have many other nations in the world. Second, the excavation was legal under Indonesian law, and it was even conducted at the request of the government. Also, when the salvage company was first hired, they were given 2 weeks to complete the entire excavation. That's insane. Now, later they were given another 2 weeks, and then a few more months, and the timeline kept changing. But you can't even recruit an academic team of archaeologists in 2 weeks. You can't do anything in 2 weeks. So the company hired professional archaeologists, but even that was difficult because Indonesia was experiencing domestic terrorism at the time, and frankly, nobody wanted to travel. Furthermore, the local fishing community closest to the wreck actually chose to bring in the salvage company. They explored their options and decided that that was the best. So, would it have been preferable to get millions of dollars in funding for an international collaborative project that lasted 10 years or more? Well, yeah, absolutely. But was that even remotely possible? Absolutely not. So this is a case where we are really lucky to get anything at all from this site. And what has been recovered is incredible. Here for the first time is tangible proof of direct trade between West and East Asia. The ship had been constructed in the Arab or Persian world, but here it was in Indonesia, packed full of over 60,000 examples of Chinese ceramics that it was carrying back to the Persian Gulf for the markets at Baghdad and Samarra. So not only was there direct trade, by the time of this ship, direct trade had been going on for a long time, enough to have established a thriving market where entrepreneurs and merchants knew what was in demand. Most of the items carried by the ship were examples of what is called Changsha ware. It's named after the city of Changsha in China, where it was produced en masse in huge kilns. The items were stacked within large ceramic jars and packed with straw to protect them during shipping, and as you can see, it clearly worked very well. Because ceramics are very heavy and easily breakable, they were really poorly suited to transport by land, but perfect for maritime shipping. Now, Changsha ware was widely used throughout China, and it's pretty simple and affordable. Kind of like, Fiesta ware or IKEA ware or something like that. So it makes sense why that would make up 90% of the cargo. The Cleveland Museum of Art has a couple of examples of Changsha ware, which it includes this large pitcher or ewer here on the right. Although just to clarify, this is not from the Belatongue wreck. Now, the Cleveland ewer was found in China, and this fragment on the left comes from the same type of vessel. You can see the color and the decoration are very similar, although the handle has broken off. And we do know that Changsha ware was mass-produced, as I said. But this fragment was not found in China, or even in Indonesia, but in Nishapur, Iran. So just one of thousands of Changsha ware fragments that have been found there. So clearly there was a definite market there, and the merchants who loaded the Belitung ship knew this, and they could count on a reliable profit for their cargo. But the Belitung wreck also carried more refined and expensive items, like this bowl from the kilns at Xi'an. It is decorated with a raised relief of a coiled dragon that's been highlighted in this beautiful green glaze. Here's a fragment from the same type of vessel, again found at Nishapur. It's really cool to see examples of this same type of ceramic, both in the Belitung wreck and in the excavations from Nishapur in the Mesopotamian region. But perhaps even more interesting than just this export from China to West Asia is the back and forth exchange that artisans and merchants exchanged in with their counterparts on the other side of the world. For example, this is a type of jar called Xingware. And this type of ceramic was among the rarest and the most desirable ceramic types in all of Asia. But rather than attracting the eye through decorative motifs or colors, Xingware is about simplicity and form and shape. The softly radiant glaze that you see here was often compared to moonlight in its luminosity. So being so precious, Xingware was not accessible for most people, but it was sometimes used for diplomatic gifts, including gifts to the Abbasid court in Iraq. Abbasid craftsmen then attempted to replicate them, but the type of white clay that's required for Xingware is not available in West Asia. So instead, they imported tin oxide from Burma or Malaya and used that to produce a white glaze and imitate that white glaze of Xingware. Now, very quickly, ceramicists began applying geometric ornamentation to these plain surfaces. The port city of Basra was known for its use of cobalt blue designs. So in this plate, there's a great deal of green, as you can see, but in the center, cobalt blue is used for the fine details in the outlines. Here again, another example of this earthenware from Basra that combines cobalt blue decorations with a white ground made from the imported tin oxide. Now, in response to this new trend in West Asian pottery, Chinese manufacturers then produced their own blue and white glazed ceramics, specifically for export back to West Asian markets. So that's where this specific plate was going when the ship carrying it ran aground on a reef off the coast of Belitung in Southeast Asia. To return to the ship at Belitung itself, you might reasonably ask how we know that it's from West Asia and not from India or China or somewhere else in East Asia. And the answer is because of how the ship was constructed. So the photo I'm showing you here is of the Jewel of Muscat. It's a type of ship called a dhow, and it was constructed beginning in 2007 as a replica of the wrecked Belitung ship in a project funded by the Sultan of Oman. Now, the wreck's timbers were made from a tree that used to grow in East Africa. So the Jewel of Muscat, too, was constructed using that same species, but it was selected, harvested, and milled in Ghana, and then transported to Oman. The same shipbuilding techniques that were used in the Belitung ship are still known in Oman today. The most distinctive aspect is that rather than nailing the boat together, as was done in Europe, or gluing it like was sometimes done in China, the planks are actually sewn together using coconut coir, or coconut fibers. Once completed, the jewel sailed from Muscat in Oman, to Singapore, stopping at 3 points along the way to restock. Although they did have chickens and a goat on board, as you can see, for eggs and milk. They also used a traditional charcoal stove, as you can see in the center, traditional water skins, and on the whole, tried as much as possible to use the same methods that the original sailors would have used. So not including the time spent in port, the voyage took about 5 months. The Jewel stopped its voyage in Singapore, where the treasure from the Belitung wreck is housed in the Asian Civilization Museum. But most merchant ships would have continued on to Guangzhou or Quanzhou, 2 port cities in southeastern China. Both cities were home to a very large foreign population in the 7th through 9th centuries especially. Historical sources tell us that Indians, Southeast Asians, and Arabs, Persians, and other West Asians had created expat communities in Chinese port cities. There were, in fact, so many foreigners that intermarriage was a major concern for the Chinese government. The marriage of a Chinese person to a foreigner was considered a crime against the emperor and punishable by exile for life. We can see this multiculturalism and prominent foreign influence in Guangzhou in Xi'an, the only known surviving Manichaean temple in the world. You might remember Manichaeism from the previous lecture. And although it's been largely absorbed into Buddhism, notice that this figure at the right, while he looks like the Buddha at first glance, has long hair falling over his shoulders and also a long forked beard, and these are two features that are not characteristic of Buddha, but they do match depictions of the prophet Mani. Now, another sign of the large foreign populations in these port cities is the fact that the oldest mosque in China is located in Guangzhou. Legend says that it was founded by one of Muhammad's companions, and while there's no evidence for or against this, Guangzhou is where Islam was first introduced into China, and it is likely that there were Muslims living in Guangzhou as early as the 7th century. And China was not the only nation cultivating trade with West Asia, however. In Korea, the Kingdom of Silla was actively establishing direct trade with Persian and Arab traders, who settled in the city of Gyeongju, especially beginning in the 7th century. This shift was hugely advantageous commercially, economically, culturally, diplomatically for both parties. Previously, Korea had had to go through China to secure imports from the West, which meant higher prices and more complications. But now, since Korea was directly getting Western goods, they weren't having to pay extra to the Chinese. Plus, Korea had their own centers for silk production. It had been introduced there by Chinese immigrants 800 years earlier, so now China had to compete with Korea for silk sales, meaning that merchants too could also achieve better profit margins. The most remarkable objects from the Shilla kingdom have been found in royal tombs at Gyeongju. Direct trade with West Asia wasn't established until the 7th century, but thanks to the discoveries in these tombs, we do know that Shilla was still in contact with Central Asia well before that, if only on an occasional or indirect basis. The object I'm showing you here is considered one of Korea's great national treasures, and I think you can see why. It is a scabbard decorated in gold and garnets that contains an iron dagger, and it was discovered in a 5th century royal tomb. So the large photo on the left is showing the handle of the dagger. Most of the iron blade itself is gone, but the scabbard is remarkably intact on the whole. Only a few pieces have gone missing over time. Now, the smaller pieces are garnet, as I mentioned. They have been cut and shaped to fit in the pockets formed by the gold work. And the very large pieces are glass, because it'd be pretty hard to find enough garnets of that size. And you can see the difference in the shine and the luminosity between the two materials. The garnets are much brighter, whereas the glass is duller. This technique of fitting cut stones and glass into gold pockets is called cloisonné. And we can see the same technique in this collar and pair of beads on the right. It's from the 5th century, so made around the same time as our dagger and scabbard found in Korea. But these items have been rather generically identified as Eastern Hunnic, which frankly could mean that they come from anywhere from Mongolia and Siberia to the Black Sea. It's like this whole swath of territory. But really, cloisonné is especially known and associated with early medieval European art and the so-called migration period, especially in the Germanic, Frankish, and Anglo-Saxon worlds. So this example at the top left was found in England. And if you're familiar with the Sutton Hoo ship burial, there are examples of cloisonné in it as well. So it seems, however, that this cloisonné technique entered Western Europe from somewhere farther east. And what's interesting, though, is that this fragment from England was produced just 100 years after the date of our scabbard found in Korea. And frankly, the workmanship is flawless. This is a masterpiece. It's clearly not somebody's first rodeo. The tradition of gold and garnet cloisonné had evidently been present in Western Europe for some time prior to the manufacture of this item in order to become of this high quality. But to find the closest match for the scabbard itself, we have to turn not to an object but to a painting, a fragment of which is on the right. Although it isn't in the best shape, you can see that there is a dagger and scabbard hanging from the belt, using a distinctive system whereby the scabbard hangs from 2 points off the belt. And if we just tilt our image a little bit, you can see that it is a nearly identical shape and type as our example from the Korean tomb. So this fresco happens to be from the Thousand Buddha Caves at Kizil, near the ancient city of Kucha. Yet this is the early 7th century king of Kucha, shown here, named Sfarnabuspe, who's commemorated in a cave temple in his honor that was commissioned by his sons after his death. So, how did a dagger and scabbard from Central Asia get to a tomb in Korea? We don't know. But it was the only foreign object in the tomb where it was found, which suggests that it was not belonging to a native of Central Asia. It wasn't someone from Central Asia who was buried there, but rather this object was a prized exotic item that had somehow made its way across the continent, whether gradually in phases or in one trip. It made its way to a member of the Xi'an royalty and was buried with them. Another site where we find West and Central Asian objects in East Asia as at Nara, Japan. Nara was the capital of Japan for only 76 years in the 8th century, but during this time it was established as an important center for Buddhism. In fact, today there are actually 19 major Buddhist temples in the city, including the Todaiji temple complex, home to this absolutely gigantic Buddha. How big is it exactly? Well, this right here is one of the monks. So you can see he's about as tall as the Buddha's finger. This place is massive. Todaiji is also the location of the Shoshoin repository, the temple's treasury that has received thousands of precious items from various sources beginning in the 8th century. And we've already encountered some of the items here in previous talks, like this mask that was used in jigaku plays that were popular from the 6th through 14th centuries. It was used for the role of the drunken barbarian leader, and its features are exaggerated from the East Asian stereotyped view of the Sogdians in Central Asia. But there were also glass vessels that were manufactured in Persia under the Sasanian Empire, as well as silk that was woven in either Byzantine Syria or the Sasanian Empire. And some of it displays designs that are characteristic of Western and Central Asia. Buddhism is a really interesting subject to explore in relation to the Silk Roads because that's how it spread, right? Monks, missionaries, and lay people spread its beliefs and practices by traveling along the same roads that everyone else was using. And in doing so, the original practice that emerged out of northwestern India was shaped and influenced in various ways by the local cultures that it encountered. So in previous talks, for example, I've introduced the Buddhist Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, is known in China as Guanyin, in Korea as Guanyin, and in Japan as Kannon. So a bodhisattva is a being that has achieved enlightenment and could pass beyond this realm into non-being, but has instead chosen to remain behind and help others on their spiritual journeys. Avalokiteshvara in particular is associated with compassion. So it's a very popular figure in particular, which makes it interesting to trace the way that he's represented across time and cultures. For example, you can see that although these 5 sculptures are made in different periods, in different places, using different materials, and they're all different sizes, they set the bodhisattva in a similar pose and maintain an elaborate crown, jewelry, drapery, and some of the same features. So it makes sense then that we find these features are still there when the bodhisattva is shown in paintings. These are 2 different paintings. They look quite similar, but it's 2 different paintings that they follow the same tradition of how Guanyin should be depicted. In both, he's seated with one leg half crossed over the other in this relaxed, regal pose and covered in jewelry and luxurious fabrics. Both of these paintings were made in Korea in 14th century, so we've jumped forward quite a bit, several hundred years. But the reason is because they're part of an interesting episode in the story of the maritime silk routes. So the painting on the left the painting on the right is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the one on the left is still in East Asia, though not in Korea. It's in Japan. In fact, nearly all Korean Buddhist paintings from the Goryeo dynasty are in Japan. So as you can imagine, the sea between China, Japan, and Korea was pretty busy with mercantile traffic, making it a prime target for pirates, who had plenty of places to hide on the many islands. Piracy in this area was the worst during the late 14th century, but we know it was going on for hundreds of years before and after that too. So this is just detail on the bottom from a much larger Chinese scroll showing Ming soldiers fighting pirates. So what happens then is that the Korean kingdoms, they want to protect their trade networks, right? So they send gifts to Japanese officials asking them to crack down on the pirates and to the pirate communities themselves, basically to buy protection. Many of these gifts were copies of Buddhist religious texts, or sutras. Starting in the 6th century, the Korean dynasties had actively collected these texts and created essentially an authoritative compendium. And copies of these texts were very highly sought after. And in fact, they were so desirable that when they were sent abroad as diplomatic gifts, paintings were sometimes sent with them as, frankly, a mere afterthought, sometimes not even recorded in the shipping inventories. So it seems that many, perhaps even most, of the Korean Buddhist paintings in Japan made their way there as part of this negotiation to secure maritime trade in East Asia. Now, over the course of the past 4 lectures, we've worked our way across Asia and looked at how the interconnectivity of cultures and the ability of people and items to travel shows up in the art and material culture of societies that are separated sometimes by thousands and thousands of miles. So to finish up, I'd like to turn to a type of object that I think really represents the Silk Roads as a whole. These are 2 examples of dragon-handled amphoras, a type of ceramic vessel that was very popular in China around the 7th century. We have many examples of them. These 2 are from the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Met in New York. And as the name says, they're distinctive for the fact that the 2 handles joining the base to the mouth of the vessel are shaped like 2 dragons. So in the West, we tend to think of dragons as like breathing fire, but in East Asia, they're usually associated with water. So it's appropriate that they'd be included here on a vessel that's often used for liquids. And because the mouths of the dragons are actually like tucked inside of the rim, it makes it look like they're drinking out of the amphora, which I think is a very clever and fun addition. But what's especially interesting about this type of vessel is that it is a Chinese interpretation and adaptation of a quintessentially Mediterranean vessel. Now, amphorae have been used in the Mediterranean world as storage vessels really arguably since the Neolithic period. And they come in all different sizes and can vary in shape, but they all have the same basic form of a swelling body, a narrow neck, and 2 opposing handles, regardless of what size they are. There are definitely examples of fancy amphorae that were heavily decorated and used for special events or as display pieces, but 99% of amphorae produced in the Mediterranean were purely utilitarian. They're basically the ancient version of milk cartons, Ziploc bags, cereal boxes, tin cans, all in one. And it was almost certainly in this form that they first came to East Asia. So not as commodities themselves, but as the container for the oils, wine, olive, spices, perfumes, or whatever that was actually the object of purchase. So in these Chinese dragon-handled amphoras, we have a foreign vessel being introduced to China, where its shape is valued aesthetically. That form is then adapted according to local Chinese tastes. But more than that, these plain amphorae were throwaway items for the merchants who first imported them into East Asia. But they became a luxury item in itself for Chinese craftsmen and collectors. So in this way, these dragon-handled amphorae are sort of representative of the kind of exchange that occurred through the Silk Roads network over the centuries. Not only exchanging bare commodities, but also ideas and aesthetics and techniques. And it wasn't simply a matter of these things just shuffling around, but of them being interpreted and reinterpreted in productive and endlessly creative ways.